I surely hope there's not one near there, but that's an area that's very vulnerable as well.
What would you say to the people living there?
Well, I think they, like the people along the East Coast and Gulf of Mexico, that need to think really hard about what their plans ought to be if a hurricane threatens, and people who live in tornado-prone areas must have a plan when tornadoes threaten. People in that region ought to know, what they can do. It will probably come with little warning, although sometimes these earthquakes give you their seismic activity starts showing up as frequent small, earthquakes, and they may get some warning that major will take place. And we see that with volcanoes too. We often get seismic signals, and we can sometimes see a thermal hotspot from satellite before there is a major volcanic eruption.
Do the volcanic eruptions around the world worry you in any way?
Well, if we're indeed, as we believe, in a cyclical pattern, and we are now moving toward a period where the sun will be unusually quiet, and the oceans, the Pacific has already turned cold, the Atlantic will be turning cold within a decade, perhaps less. That if we get a major eruption like Tambora that occurred in Indonesia back in 1815 time frame, that could really accelerate a cooling. We're already seeing cooling over the last decade. That's probably a shock to some people, but global temperatures have not risen since 1998, and since in the last 10 years, even as measured by the Hadley Center in the UK, which is the center used by the UN to track climate change, temperatures globally have declined slightly in 10 years. In the United States, our average winter temperature has declined 4.13 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 10 years. That's rather significant. And if indeed we get a major eruption like that, the cooling which has started, and we're seeing it in winter, terrible winters they've had in Northern Europe and in the United States, will become even more severe, and even the summers will be significantly affected. We had in 2009 the coldest July in history in the central United States. You had a miserable summer last year in California and the coastal areas. It was hot in the east, but it was very cold in the west. I think the summer, July and August, will be cold again in the Midwest, even though they've had a little bit of heat in June. We think that July and August will be chilly again. In the year 1816, followed that major volcanic eruption, Tambora. It was called the year without a summer, because all around the world there was frost and cold, even snow, even in the summer months. And so that was a very similar period in terms of the sun. It was called a Dalton minimum. The sun went very quiet, like it has done in the last decade. And the sun has behaved in the last 4 decades very much like it did in the late 1700s and early 1800s, as sort of a prelude to the Dalton minimum and the year without a summer. So if we get a major eruption, that just could accelerate. We've had some high-latitude eruptions in Alaska, Redoubt and Kasatochi, in Iceland in the last couple of years. We had one in Russia, Sarychev. All of these high-latitude eruptions help build up the cold air masses in winter that make it so cold in mid-latitudes. And that's been the case the last 3 years.
I've read a lot of articles about such tremendous cold in China in Russia and in other areas of Europe that animals died off, that food supply became scarce, that crops died. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about how the weather is affecting agriculture.
That's one of the areas that we look at on Weatherbell. We try to use our knowledge of global weather patterns and historical perspective of global weather patterns to predict the weather for major agricultural regions, to predict the weather for energy needs. We knew it was going to be a brutal winter in Western Europe, especially early in the winter last year and the year before, and in the eastern United States, northern United States this year. We had predicted that the year before would be cold across all of Europe and Asia, which it was. The whole winter would be, and that had a tremendous impact on helping to cause energy prices to rise. And we had a very cold winter in the United States in 2009 and 10 as well. But in the summer of 2010, we knew it was going to be very hot, and that was going to have a major effect in the United States on energy usage, and certainly that was the case. That's a classic La Nina following an El Nino winter. And that happened in 1988, 99, 95, 66, 55 years in which were very warm in the summer months. So we had seen that, and now we're in our second year La Nina that's typically cooler in the central United States, and that's the basis of our forecast. But to come back to your question about how it affects agriculture, of course, when you know what the weather patterns are going to be, where the jet streams are going to dip and where they're going to rise, and you know what areas are most subject to drought, flood, freezes. So we, for example, this year we warned before the winter that the southern plains of the United States would have a significant drought. It would extend east to Florida, that would affect the winter wheat crop in a big way. And it's the third worst drought in Texas, the winter and spring drought, in history, behind only 1918 and 1956. And so the winter wheat crop has been significantly hurt by that drought. And that may affect some of the summer crops. So that's not a major summer crop area, but they grow wheat in the western plains. And we knew that was going to be a problem area. We knew that France was going to have some problems this year. And
what kind?
That it was going to be dry in France, and that was going to affect the winter grains, and that's certainly been the case. We said that weeks before it made the news, and now they're very concerned about 30% drop in crop yields from France.
So you're doing more than giving predictions based in the United States. How did you know about France?
Well, the same patterns that are analogs, are correlations to the past, that work in the United States, they work globally. So when we know it's what's going to happen in the United States, we can, in those same years, use that information to say, well, look at that. It was very dry in France. It was normally wet in India, so they got to have a good monsoon there. That's one of the big growing areas. That the drought in China is going to end with decent rainfall in the summer.
That's good.
That's the kind of thing that we've been able to predict. In the last few years, there's been research that said high latitude volcanoes cause a very erratic monsoon in India. And so when we had eruptions in 2008 and 9, we said, well, India, you may get your monsoon on schedule, but then it may take a break and there could be some issues. And that's exactly what happened. And we gave our clients and those people that are involved in trading agricultural commodities are very interested in getting a heads up on major problem areas like that. We also look in the southern hemisphere with a fair amount of